the remembrances are very sharp because it was the first ever traumatic event politically that had happened in the life of my entire generation, not only of journalists but of people of India. So it was something that was totally unexpected. We had no experience of how to cope with it. So every day was a new fear, a new discovery, a new response, and it continued for the 20 months or so that the emergency lasted.
And sir, you are a working journalist at that time. What is your experience as a journalist and what kind of difficulties have you faced during the emergency?
I am now more than 51 years in the profession. In fact, I became a journalist in 1969. So it's a very long time ago. Before the emergency, it was a normal life, happy life covering activities in Delhi and around Delhi, political, social, police, crime, sports. A normal life. The emergency struck us from the first day. We were working on what is called Fleet Street, Bahadur, Shah, Zafar, Marg, and the electricity went off. It was almost the first time ever in the history of Indian journalism that electric current to the presses had been cut off. We had no clue when it was coming back. We knew it was the government cutting off power because the Delhi Electric Supply Undertaking told us that it was not a fault, it was a closure. So we knew that the government wanted to, in future, control or suppress the press because it would be impossible to stop the press, but controlling was considered possible. The next day after the emergency, we learned that several journalists had also been arrested, together with almost the entire stock of senior politicians across the country. And it was a big blow, but very few papers came out the next day to tell us that emergency had been declared. So most people knew of the emergency not through the media, but through All India Radio's and Doordarshan's announcement by Indira Gandhi herself that she had declared emergency.
And what kind of difficulties have you faced during the emergency to do some story regarding the emergency?
See, during the 22 months or so of the emergency, the difficulties were put in our way by Sanjay Gandhi. He was not a political figure. We knew nothing about him. We didn't know him at all. He was only the second son of the Prime Minister. That's all that we knew about him. But soon it was clear that the police, the government, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, the Health Ministry, they were all running at his command. That the Delhi's Lieutenant Governor, the Delhi's IGP, the Delhi's Municipal Commissioner, all of them were reporting to him as if he were in fact the Lieutenant Governor or the Prime Minister of India. And that was also a blow because government should be practiced by those in government, either elected to the government or appointed to the government, either politicians or bureaucrats. But to see the government run by a private individual, by government officials, by politicians, by bureaucrats, by medical doctors, by senior vice chancellors of the country, bowing and kowtowing to him, was a blow to the intellect, a blow to our understanding of democracy. And that was in reality what struck us, an absence of democracy. And even today, the one thing that we can feel immediately is when there's an absence of democracy, when there's an absence of freedom. The presence of freedom is when you experience it. It's not something that is like night and day, but the absence of freedom strikes you because it leaves a vacuum in your life, it leaves a vacuum in your intellectual space, it leaves a vacuum in your experience, that the same person who was responding to you in a different way, the same police officer, the same doctor, the same vice chancellor, the same municipal commissioner, who was responding to you in one way, when there was democracy, suddenly changed as a human person, as if he didn't know you. There was no response to normal courtesies. He was certainly an autocrat, reflecting the autocracy that Sanjay Gandhi had brought into the body politic of the country.
And what was the effect of emergency on the culture of media organization and the reporters in general?
The media before the emergency was still a continuation of the independence media. It still thought of life as a culture, as a task, as a duty, as a mission. It expected a democratic ground in which it could function. Young journalists joined it out of a sense of dedication or sort of commitment. It was not another job. There was a sense of mission that as a journalist you could do something. It was just not to obey orders, but to respond to life as it was happening and see if you could change it for the better by exposing corruption, by exposing wrong things that were being done, and bringing the government to task. That was the life in which we were encouraged to enter when we became journalists in the 60s or the early 70s. Emergency, as I said, the absence of democracy immediately showed us how weak journalism was, how easy it was to subvert journalism. As later Lal Krishan Advani, who himself had a big role in subjugating journalism later, said at that time that when journalists were asked to bend, they lay down flat, they crept. And this was a reality, because face to face with the uncertainty of democracy, face to face with the threat that your physical independence would be taken away, that you would be put to jail, that you would rot in jail without bail, as you are seeing in the case of others then, and you're seeing now. It was 22 months then, it's 5 years now. That fear took the spine out of most working journalists. And more than the working journalists themselves, it took out the spine of the employers, of the owners of journalism, of the owners of newspapers. There were no private televisions, only newspapers were there. And the owners of those newspapers absolutely crept and crawled in front of Sanjay Gandhi.
Sir, we know the many journalists like Kuldeep Nayyar and Arun Shourie and others. If you were asked to remember some senior journalists and their role in those days, how do you remember them as a journalist?
Arun Shourie was not a big journalist then, but Kuldeep Nayyar was an editor. He was also a little in politics. Journalists who were in politics were arrested. Professional journalists like us, we were warned but not arrested. We faced censorship but were not really in control of the government. But the arrest even of Kuldeep Nayyar sent a wave like a threat to journalism at large, that this is what could also happen to you. That it is not just politicians who are being arrested, but you, if you don't obey, will also be arrested. So it was a threat which had its impact. Journalism were docile, journalists were docile, they became even more subjugated, even weaker. So censorship, when it was imposed, then led to a self-censorship. Most journalists were not even reporting. Some, like in the newspaper I was, still could make their own freedom and report, which we did and which later we converted into a book on the emergency. It was the first book on the emergency, Reasons of State, Delhi Under the Emergency, by John Dayal and Ajay Bose. It was republished several times after that. It was the first book. It was published when the emergency was just lifting, early 77. We could write that book because we were able to collect material while the emergency was on. We were the only ones really who had detailed material, including government literature, on things like demolitions, things like forced and forcible sterilizations, how civic plans, how government plans were changed to suit the whims of Mr. Sanjay Gandhi. We could collect that material. We were eyewitness to these events. We could broadly report those events, taking a grave risk to our own liberty. And then when emergency was about to be lifted, we were easily among the first to be able to report it.
Any memory you want to share about during the emergency period?
We wrote a book on it. The memory is 10 times that book. The many things, the absence of civil liberties, the focus of atrocities on Gandhian institutions, including the Gandhi Peace Foundation, the censorship, the need to take your newspaper to the government office for a government servant to say, keep this, remove this, keep this, remove this, cut that, change that. Having to obey orders, having to forcibly cover the activities of Mr. Sanjay Gandhi, who was an extra-constitutional center of authority. And this is something that is one of the symbols of emergency at that time or any other time after that. When you become obedient not only to the government, but to those who are not in government, but close to the government, or those who run, the politicians who run the government. So second-hand power sources become important, whether they are people with money or they are people with extra constitutional power.